Yet, but we just want to make sure we get to see all of Laara's presentation, so I'm going to start. So good morning. My name is Christie Geiss. I will be your host for the webinar this morning. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, which include Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and Musqueam Nation. We recognize and respect them as nations in this territory and the opportunity to work and play on their lands. Some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section. Once the presentation has completed, we will open the floor to questions, which you can either put in the Q&A box or raise your hand and we will invite you to unmute and to ask your questions. The raise your hand button should be in the right bottom corner, depending on what you're on. I also want to remind you of our fundraiser for Reconciliation Canada. This campaign will end on September 30th. Cove has pledged to match all donations up to a cumulative total of $5,000. So please consider giving today. The link is in the chat. There's a large chat, so I can put it in there again in a minute. It would be great if we could reach our goal of $10,000 of giving. I want to thank everyone for attending and provide you with some background for Kileepi Piseesi. Kileepi Piseesi is an organization that funds and participates in reconciliation action projects in First Nation communities around BC in collaboration with businesses, high school students, Indigenous communities, and First Nation governments. Through these projects, we learn about the rich heritage and traditions of Indigenous cultures and the truth about historic treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, systemic racism, and how we can affect positive change through community development for the benefit of current and future generations. We have two types of projects that we do, orca projects and hummingbird projects. The orcas are usually 2 or 3 days in length, and we usually travel to the nation's home territory. We then carry out any work that is requested of us by the community. The hummingbird projects are usually half days or full days done in a local area. We have completed one orca project and several hummingbird projects. Unfortunately, COVID had stopped one of our orca projects that was scheduled for 2020. We are hoping with the easing of restrictions that we can reschedule more projects in the future. These projects have been life-changing for me and have taught me a lot. I encourage anyone who is interested in being involved in these projects to reach out, and we would love to have more people and companies involved. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Laara Yaghujaanas. She owns and operates Cardin Consulting, which was established in 1997. Laara is from the Yaghujaanas clan of the Haida Nation and carries her great-grandmother's name, Kunkoyas. Laara holds a master's degree from Royal Rose University and was awarded the Royal Rose University Founders Award, has completed the Justice Institute Conflict Resolution and Negotiation course, is a CTT Certified Consultant, Level 2, a member of the Council of Native Development Officers, CANDO, a member of the New Relationship Trust Economic Development Support Team, and is an advisor for Indigenous Business Awards. Laara is currently pursuing her PhD in Indigenous Governance with the University of Victoria. We are so honored to have her join us to speak about truth and ReconciliAction. So get ready to unsettle yourself. Laara.
Good morning, everyone. Hadla Isis, Aklins is akte gudne lagan, kadnis Yaghujaanas, Hada Uda Ijin. What I said in our old Haida language, excuse me, was welcome, good people. I am Yaghujaanas Haida of the Dogfish House of Dadans. My inherited name is Kunkoyas or Laara Yaghujaanas, and my family name is, my family is from Gaukli Masset. I've got a little bit of a sore throat this morning. I'd like to acknowledge the opportunity to work on the unceded territories where I'm coming to you from of the Tsauk people. So thank you so much for joining us today. What we're going to be doing is talking about unsettling yourself. It's really a way to be able to capture and talk about what we're experiencing in Canada, what those things are you can do to support ReconciliAction in your community for the benefit of current and future generations. I'm also proud to be a board of directors for the Kileepi Piseesi Society, and really happy to see this work being done by the leaders from Cove Financial to be able to ensure that this work happens in our own communities across Canada. We've been doing this work for about 25 years, primarily working with and for First Nations in BC and in Canada to support good governance, policy design and development, comprehensive community planning, legislation, drafting legislation with communities for membership codes, custom election codes. And we're very happy to be able to be doing this work, which started about 15, 17 years ago with the development of this workshop in its initial format with elders from the Coast Salish Nation territories. What we're going to be doing is taking that, and it's evolved over time, and we're going to be talking about the true history of Canada, how to advance reconciliation, and how you can do that work as well. So we're going to start off with Canada's true history. And it's really important that we do this to be able to start with understanding the lands that we're on, the people who were here previously. And that's our first peoples who lived and thrived on these lands since what we call time immemorial. For us, that means since the time of humans being on this planet. Evidence right now, so archaeological evidence is documented it from 15,000 years to 18,000 years, long before the Roman Empire and the origins of a lot of Western history. In our communities, we had complex political and economic systems that were integrated at all levels into our societies and met the needs of our community members for the current and future generations. All of those things were integrated with the laws of the land and respecting all living things. We established lands and those kinds of works that we did in our communities using a very elegant shared leadership system that was a very democratic system, very much tied to the needs and interests of individuals being able to voice their ideas on those things they want to see in their communities, their needs and interests for future generations. Our communities were egalitarian. Children were well cared for, women were well cared for, elders were valued. And when elders did their work, one of the most important things they did, in addition to being the knowledge keepers and historians that maintain not only the families and connections and laws and agreements of our people, they also helped promote and develop our youth, including looking for their strengths, their gifts, and being able to communicate with others in the community to identify those gifts and to be able to grow and develop them for them to reach their full potential. Learning was considered lifelong. We would learn from cradle to grave, and we made sure that at all times that this kind of communal or collective value set was one that contributed to the benefit of everybody. So we weren't focused on being a civilized society as defined by the Greeks and the Western world. We were focused on supporting and developing the well-being of our people. When we took a look at that, it was also considered what we call in the Western world spirituality, where there was a connection, understanding to all those things around us, the people, throughout time, those ancestors that were behind us and holding us up, and those future generations that are not yet born. Life itself was a gift from the Creator. We had that inherent right. We had those understandings of our worth and our identity and our sovereignty gifted directly from the Creator, not through other means, for example, a sovereign or a monarch, through the divine right of kings. So we did have a very connected and very integrated lifestyle. There were challenges for sure. We still had unrest in some times, and being Haida myself, there is certainly a history of warring and those kinds of things that would happen, but they were not common. They were not the most important thing for us. They were not about ways to have power over others. It was about a different way of being. And there's lots of questions that being Haida that we get asked. So I'm happy to answer those at any point as well. In the long term, our community was focused again on 7 generations. We see as articulated from a lot of the Plains nations and on the West Coast, future generations. So we looked at thousands of years into the future. So for example, our Haida land and water strategy is a 1,000-year strategy, not a 4-year strategy or a 2-year election cycle strategy. It's a 1,000-year strategy. When we did see conflict in our communities, it was rare. And I'm thinking about when we worked for the Tsilhqot'in Nation. They articulated it so beautifully that conflict was rare because everyone was raised from cradle to grave to be humble and respectful and learn and adhere to the laws in our communities that made sure that everyone was taken care of and respected and connected. This is opposed to what we see in the Western origins of our Western civilization, which came from the Romans, Aristotle and Plato, where it was based on adversarial system or a system of lawmaking that was who could argue the best, and that was a rights-based society, which is what is ubiquitous in our society today. When we take a look at those enduring values, those things that are most important to us as a people, we always like to share that as collectivist-based peoples rather than individualistic-based peoples, which is what is, according to Geert Holstedt, who's a Dutch researcher who recently passed and spent more than 50 years researching values around the world every single year, our values were collectivist, and as opposed to the Western US model, which is individualistic. And our collectivist values took a look at understanding the interconnection of all things and all people to ensure that we had an understanding of the care and respect that we must carry. These are reflected in a lot of the terms you may have heard or may not have heard, that in BC is Natsamat. We're all one. We're all interconnected. Nameya, all one, a common humanity, one connected whole. In our own Haida language, it's reflected in everything depends on everything else. That's interconnection. And that is the reality of not only our First Nations, but one of the core fundamental teachings that theologians have identified across all religions at the deepest level and at the scientific level in physics, where we take a look at quantum mechanics. It is an understanding that all of us are connected in some way. In Hawaiian, it's Hershak Shawak. Everything is connected, everything is one. And in the Plains, you hear quite often, all my relations. That doesn't mean just all my relations in terms of my sister sitting next to me, my brother sitting next to me. It is my connection with the earth, with the animals, with the plants, with my ancestors, with the future generations. It's meant to be very much my relation to everything. When we take a look at that worldview and that core value that's shared across First Nations, we also have to recognize too that value of land, that it's very much a holistic relationship, not just to the land, but to the waters and all living things above and below the land. And that means the ocean, those things that live in the ocean, those things that live in the sky, those things that live on the land. And recognizing that in our world, that those values that First Nations have to steward and protect the lands and waters and all those living things on it become from the understanding that we are of the land. We are related to the land, and our origins come from that land. Our laws come from the land is a very common saying as well. And I love this quote that I wanted to share with you. All my elders say that it's the land that holds all knowledge in life and death and is a constant teacher. It said in Okanagan that the land constantly speaks. Not to learn its language is to die. And I can't think of anything more salient in terms of a message for our environmental world crisis right now. Climate change would be a very different thing if we had embraced these kinds of learnings from the time of colonization. And now we're only turning our minds to understanding these things, this wisdom and knowledge that our First Nations have held for thousands of years for the benefit of not only our First Nations, but all future generations. The other important values that we share as Indigenous people are shared leadership. We never had a hierarchy that was a long-standing way to govern a people. It really is a hierarchical control, is more command and control and used primarily by the military. And it has its purpose in times of crisis, and First Nations would use those in times of crisis, rallying themselves behind the experts and people that they felt were important to guide them as a people. But then it would revert back to a shared leadership system where many people had a say in the democracy, in the decisions that affect them. And that is something that has been taken away in colonization, as we'll talk about, and we're trying to revitalize as well. There was also community and relational accountability, which means that when we do say we're going to do something, we do it. We come back and we share what we've done. It's very much around accountability and good governance. And again, this was something that we had for thousands of years and was interrupted purposefully and taken away and built out of systems so that that knowledge was not something that was passed on that would inform any kind of identity for our peoples as a part of the genocide and colonization effort by the Western world, as we saw over the last couple hundred years. I love this quote I wanted to share with you. When you contextualize yourself in the community, with your family, with your people, and eventually when you contextualize yourself and the planet and the rest of all living things, it demands integrity. Otherwise, you destroy yourself. And it's a beautiful book by Dr. Sean Wilson, who wrote this as a letter for his thesis to his baby boy. And if you ever want to read about working with Indigenous people, it's a beautiful, beautiful read, and it's not too difficult. It's called Research as Ceremony. And Dr. Sean Wilson has been a fantastic speaker for us in that regard. One of the other values that we hold is elders are highly respected. They were our knowledge keepers. They were our ones who kept track of laws, who kept track of who was within each clan, who was within each extended family. Even today, when I go introduce myself and I'm different communities across BC, very often, very, very often, I'll go into community and introduce myself. And I'm always taught to do myself as a protocol introduction, as you heard at the outset, so that people know what family I am and they recognize that connection, which means that I am required to adhere and uphold those ancestors and act with integrity to be able to do the work I do. And when we introduce ourselves in that way, it's amazing how many elders say, "Oh, from what family? Oh, I know." And then they will paint the family tree of people that are hundreds sometimes of miles away and know these family trees. This is what our elders used to do. And interestingly, what they've done is in the last couple of decades, they've done research on Indigenous elders versus Canadian elders, and they found, and North American elders, and they found that the incidence of Alzheimer's and dementia is much lower because our elders work and develop their brains and are valued and active in our societies, as opposed to entropy or lack of use of that muscle and that thinking and that activity and that identity and need in community that our Western elders receive when they're put into seniors' homes quite often. When we take a look at all those origin legends and stories, the societal laws, you can understand why our elders are so important to us and why they're treated with such care. And we ask others to treat them with such care because they're very, very valued to us. Now, we want to talk about how we got here. And it's really important because when we start talking about reconciliation, ReconciliAction, this is one of the most important premises, is to understand and recognize the harm done. And for so many years, for 150 years, really, the true history of Canada has been buried. It's something that there's been a willful blindness to. And it's only in this generation, at this point in time in history, that we're starting to see it spoken about. And it makes my heart so glad that this is happening. It's a way to make things right in our societies for future generations. And as having kids myself, nothing could be more important to me. So I really appreciate everyone being here today and your efforts that I hope will carry forward from this workshop to do the same. When we take a look at how we got here, it's really important to understand some of the origins of this. So if you look at critical race theory or many of the other kinds of research out there, the whole idea of racism as a social construct, the whole idea of civilization being the primary impetus or the primary driver of all societies, all came from the ancient Greeks, as did dehumanizing others. And what happened in ancient Greece is they were adjacent to lands that were rich and bountiful. And when they had challenges with their lands and weren't able to produce and take care of their people to the degree they liked, they developed a system of dehumanizing the people that lived next to them, the barbers, the barbarians, and called them savages, lawless, and infantilized those groups to be able to say that they were less than human. and therefore we have a right to go take what's theirs. And that begat a legacy of colonization that was passed on from the ancient Greeks to the Romans, to the Brits, to the Western world, and the monarchs and kings and queens who used that to be able to enrich themselves and their nations. This whole practice of civilization then became entrenched by the churches working hand in hand with the state, the ruling monarchs. And what happened in 1455 is the papal bulls that was called the Doctrine of Discovery was enacted. And it's basically a law that goes out to the land when a papal bull is issued. And that papal bull pronounced that those countries who were colonizers, Spain, Portugal, England, were to colonize lands and assert colonial sovereignty, dominion, title, and jurisdiction of those lands. And I'll read off exactly what it says in a minute. And it remains the basis, this whole idea of doctrine of discovery remains the basis of domestic and international law. So all Canadian law is premised on this idea that this papal bull doctrine of discovery is something that is fact. Now, what it says is that the doctrine of discovery, the mandate, was to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans. That means anyone who is not Christian, anyone who is not white, and whosoever, and make enemies of them. Hopefully that sounds familiar at this point. And make sure that those kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, so everything that's theirs, lands, everything, and reduce them to persons, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and apply and appropriate to himself and their successors kingdoms, dukedoms, countries, principalities, possessions, and goods, and convert them to his use and profit. So we're going to call them less human. You are now granted the right to take anything you want of anyone else's that's not us, that's not Christian. So again, you can start to see where our Canada's founding idea is of this country, where its laws come from, why we got to this point. And what happened is not only Canada, but other colonizing countries like the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and others actually shared crib notes. What are you doing to these Indigenous people? How can we do it better? Oh, you guys did this? Oh, cool. You tortured them this way. Okay, let's try it here. Oh, you did this to them. Oh, let's do it over here. It really became a fine art that was celebrated in Canada, with many letters going to different colonial leaders, to Ottawa and back to the Crown, to celebrate these horrific acts. So that was the thinking of the time. And again, we can look at it from today, how wrong it is, but we cannot deny it happening, and we must understand how it came about so we never repeat this. So as a result of the doctrine of discovery, what happened was in 1630, as early as 1630, we start to see missionaries and residential schools established to rip apart children from their parents, forcibly remove them to what it was substandard education. So that the priests, the nuns that were responsible and funded by the government to create these residential schools had no educational training. They had no idea what they were doing. And they were out there to save our souls, to do the work the church directed them to do. In that time, there was the many wars. And in BC, there was a few critical and pivotal wars that were arising where First Nations fought to protect this land with some of those colonizing countries. And return for that, in 1763, King George III recognized and asserted the Royal Proclamation, recognizing First Nations as partners with Canada. It was a really, really important piece for First Nations because that Royal Proclamation recognized us as partners. So rather than that diminishment. So that was all this wonderful kind of development of this country and understanding of where some of these ideas come from. And then within about 50 years of 1763, what we saw is the masses being informed by eugenics and scientific racism to start saying, in particular here where we're close to Victoria, we don't like them being on the lands there. We want to use it for our own purposes. Local government, can you please get rid of all of them? All those First Nations are bothering us. We don't like them being there because we want that land. And the local government start to rally together and do the work that the local citizenry asked them to do. And they started moving people out of their lands, and they started to enact this kind of colonization. And so from 1820 to 1927, there were several acts and policies created to do just that. And together, those became, and those together became what's called the Indian Act. And that was developed by Sir John A. Macdonald, who was a firm believer in eugenics. So you might be wondering what eugenics is at this point. And if you haven't heard of it before, it's pseudoscience. Again, racism is a social construct, but it was embedded with the science of the day, which was saying that, according to Carl Linnaeus, who in the book System Natura in 1767 outlined 5 species of humans based on Aristotle's ladder of development. And he postulated that white people at their very top of the ladder, and the darker you were, the less human you were. And to move up the ranks, to go to school or develop yourself, was an act against God. And so some of the things that they said were horrific things that came out of that kind of thinking, including in 1839, Morton, who wrote another book looking at the comparative view of skulls. And in Morton's case, he asserted that Caucasians had the biggest brains. Again, pseudoscience. First Nations being in the middle, and Negroes had the smallest and reflected intellectual capacity. Again, trying to equate further that the darker one's skin was, the less human they were. When we take a look at those together, it really begat this whole idea of the Indian Act and this kind of race-based activities that is completely created from faulty, illogical, uninformed ideas. And we know that today, but back then that was the science of the day. So you can understand why those decisions were made, because quite often when we've done these workshops in the past, people would say, why would they do that? So we really wanted to paint an understanding that this is what people were being told in that day and age. Now, with this huge age of information, we can see how wrong it is. And it's really important to be able to understand where these things came from again, so we don't repeat it. When Sir John A. Macdonald put these acts together, it really became what was a genocide of a people. In 1853, it created legislation determining who is blood quantum, meaning that aside from dogs and horses in the history of human beings, that First Nations and Indigenous people were now being judged on who they were by their blood. Not just by identity, but their rights, their oppression, their what they would be subject to based on their blood. And one of the other pieces that came in this definition of who was Indian was that assuming that because they're incapable of managing their own affairs, because they're less human, they're incapable of managing their own affairs, which means they are considered wards of the state. Now, that's a really important one to think about, because that still remains in law and in practice today in many different damaging ways that we'll talk about, including lands. All lands that First Nations hold and steward on their small parcels of lands they have left on reserves are held by the Crown, meaning that we are incapable of managing our own affairs, which is crazy, and that we can never really own our own lands. And it's really important to understand that all those advantages that we have and we know associated with African American wealth models, that we can build and own a home and then pass it on to our kids and build that wealth and quality of life over generations for our future kids to have that kind of quality of life we hope for, is completely impossible for First Nations, because we can never own our own land because of these laws that still exist today. In 1857, the Gradual Civilization Act, I'm not making up that name, it was the name of that act, the Gradual Civilization Act, established religious residential schools, established enfranchisement, and we will talk about residential schools. Enfranchisement was a law that said if First Nations and Indigenous people were met these certain criteria, they would relinquish their status. So if I married someone who wasn't First Nations, I would no longer be entitled to be calling myself First Nations, including being required to move out of my community, away from my family, and not being able to return. If I went to go serve in the army to protect our country, for all Canadians, I would be enfranchised as well and have my identity removed, not be allowed to go back to my community, not be able to live with my family again. If I wanted to go get higher learning, other than a few careers we were allowed to have, like nursing or fishing, we were enfranchised. So if I wanted to get a degree, if I wanted to get higher learning in any way, shape, or form, I was enfranchised and had those things removed. When we take a look at those federal reserves, again, we still don't have title to those lands like we all enjoy in the Western world, fee simple lands. And what also happened as a result of that too is this whole idea of what was shared territory, where we would respect our neighbors and say, over the lands that we have between where we live, there's fishing and hunting and all these resources that we can both enjoy, and we'll go over here and we'll talk once in a while and we'll connect, and maybe our kids will get married and we'll share these resources so we're all the better for it. This whole act also started to create these boundaries to say, that is a Squamish nation, that is a Musqueam nation, here's the hard line, you guys fight over it. The divide and conquer, the ultimate divide and conquer. So you can understand through all these eugenic inspired laws why there's been such a disregard, disrespect, and resentment of Sir John A. Macdonald, because he was firmly committed to eugenics, not just for Indigenous people, for Asians. He didn't believe that Asian people were human. They were less than human. Anyone of color, African American, including the challenges that Douglas had, being half African American, was that he had to fight for his identity and ended up doing all sorts of great things that weren't recognized in the same way, perhaps because of that. But those policies included things like imposing patriarchy. Again, so First Nations systems were built on matrilineal systems. So, for example, in my clan, our matriarch holds and maintains all of our gathering spots, all of our fishing spots, all of those areas that are important to us to maintain our people and our identity and to make sure they're taken care of. And what happened in colonization is they said, let's remove those women, because we know it's a patrilineal society in the Western world, the colonizing countries, again, born from the Greeks, where women are less than human, they're possessions and of men. In our First Nations communities, they were the ones who held these important understandings and stewardship to be able to make sure that our lands were protected. And they removed women from the picture so that they could say now, these lands, and the head man only, not women, were allowed to be able to come and sign documents and be able to have those discussions. The Indian Act also assaulted those types of traditional governing systems, those beautiful systems that we know in the Western world of shared leadership, horizontal structures, empowering those peoples as teams, was disallowed. We had an imposed chief and council system which had no assembly process, which meant it was never even a government. It was just a way to, again, command and control of those First Nations. And so it made our nations incapable of operating effectively and absolutely removed any traces of democracy and the strength of our ancestral governing systems and our shared leadership systems. Other things that were in there was the extra legal actions that were called the pass system. So if you remember in high school, this is exactly how First Nations had to live. Or in elementary school, you had a pass. In this case, they had small lands that they were pushed onto, 1/10, 1/100th of the size of their ancestral territories. And they were said, you cannot leave this land. And an Indian agent literally went out there and said, you cannot leave this land and go visit or move off of these lands for any reason unless you get a pass from me. Again, this is not a law. This is just something that RCMP, that was formed to control First Nations, as well as the Indian agent, did to make sure that they could control and subdue and take from First Nations. And literally, if you were just visiting a community when this happened, you now had to live there and you wouldn't be able to go back home. And so even if someone was sick, they'd have to wait for the Indian agent to give them a pass and get that person to give them a pass to go. And they were only allowed a certain number of days or hours to go do the work they need to do. And then they had to come back and they had to show this pass along the way. So that is something that happened for 60 years. And together, all of those bills became the Indian Act. To this day, it has changed very little, and it maintains control of all lands and resources. Again, all lands held by First Nations are held in trust by the Crown. That means that if we want to have a community and build a gas station or build a grocery store, we have to go to Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, today called Indigenous Services Canada, to ask permission to do that. And then they have to do, it takes years. I think the most recent one I saw was about 5 or 6 years to go through all the hoops that they create and burn up all the funds that go to First Nations in Canada. And the vast 90% or more goes to running this bureaucracy called Indigenous Services Canada, with pennies on the dollar going to First Nations. And so maintaining that control of the lands is all about just that, including allocating lands for BC Hydro. So for an example, BC, all of the power that comes from our BC Hydro grid is from on First Nations reserve lands. And if they could, they would just be able to switch the plug and turn off the power in BC. Also, some of those laws that are still in there, it dictates who's status and who's not status. Again, you don't see that in the Western world for anything other than dogs and horses to dictate blood quantum and status or not status. And in terms of academic research, it is a huge immoral affront to a people to say another person will determine for another group of people whether you're Italian, whether you're Portuguese, whether you're any nationality. Someone else would determine if you are or aren't. Now, there's also a whole method to this madness, is that if we take a look at that type of development over time, it's intended to be able to reduce our population over time so that we cease to exist. Even if we are still existing, that we won't be recognized as status, as they define it. So even though in our ancestral laws and practices, for the most part, if someone wanted to move in our community, like a lot of you good people, and said, I want to move here and do good things, and here's what skills I have, and this is what I'd like to contribute, and I agree to live to the law according to the laws and rules and culture of your people, and I want to just be a good person, that person would be accepted into the community and adopted. We still are adopting people into different communities. My husband is going to be adopted for all his work into the Haida Nation in the next little while. When we take a look, however, at the imposed way of identifying people, the Indigenous Services Canada still says you can only be Indigenous if you can prove in writing who your mother is, who your grandmother is, and then we can track whether they have sufficient blood quantum, enough, 51% or more blood that is First Nations from their own records, not from yours, from their records, which were incomplete and not right for the most part. When we take a look at, again, financial control of First Peoples by the federal government, they established massive, what's today trillions of dollars in trusts from an economy built by First Nations and the fur trade that became the economy of Canada. A huge portion, trillions of dollars today, held by Canada for First Nations who are incapable of managing their own affairs. And through settlements or agreements or whatever understandings happened at that time, these trusts were developed in different forms and formats. And those monies just disappeared. There's a lot of documentaries about this. Trillions of dollars that the government used and they still don't know where it went. And some of it was used to pay for other settlements. The vast majority of it just disappeared. Prohibiting first, and we still do have trusts today that are very hard for First Nations to access. Prohibiting First Peoples to own their own land. Again, we spoke about that. Forced a new form of education. Again, our educational systems that are recognized as best practices in education are something that is comprehensive, that is meant to be critical learning at the deepest level. And this whole Western model of education is rote memorization designed based on an industrial system to build a low qualified labor pool for industry. It's not meant to be a higher learning. It's not meant to support critical learning. It is really just rote memorization to create a low-skilled labor pool. And that is what we have today. And there's very little critical research on our education system in the Western world. And we know that, again, First Nations educational systems is becoming to be recognized as best practices to support everybody to learn and to develop themselves in the best way possible. They also expropriate lands. Again, we talked about that earlier. BC Hydro, CN Rail, huge swaths of land. And today we still see it at work. The pipeline going through that TMX was originally proposing was one that went through non-Indigenous lands because it was the most effective, least harmful route. And everyone said, no way, not in my backyard. And so what did they do? They traced a circuitous path through First Nations land and said, we're doing it. We don't care if you want it or not. So that's very much an act of colonization. And that's part of what the government still has its laws to be able to do, and bought by the government of Canada and Trudeau. Imposing reserves on legal government structures, which I already talked about. Established residential schools, day schools, and Indian hospitals. And we'll talk a bit more about day schools and Indian hospitals that are just really coming to light to understand what they were. Little things that have been removed are things that First Peoples were not allowed to get legal counsel. They weren't allowed to solicit funds for legal counsel to place legal claims. They prohibited the sale of ammunition and the control and the ability to sell agriculture from their farms because, for example, in Stolo territory in the Chilliwack area, what they found is that First Nations worked so hard that they were able to outsell their neighboring farmers. And so as that competition got increased for those settler farmers, they imposed a rule at the local level and then at the provincial level and then at the federal level saying that First Nations couldn't use machinery to be able to work their farms. So disabling and creating this inequity for First Nations so that they couldn't succeed. Forbade First Nations from speaking native language, practicing traditional religion, appearing in public dance or wearing regalia. So any of those things people would be thrown in jail for as soon as they did that. Can you imagine being Sikh and wearing your religious and cultural attire and being thrown in jail for it? And again, it's not something that's too far-fetched, but if you can imagine others like European cultures wearing their regalia, that gives them pride and being thrown in jail for it. It forbade First Nations from forming political organizations, not allowing First Peoples to vote, and formalizing that kind of support for residential schools. Other things that were still in there that have been removed, the potlatch law you've all heard about, the whole idea of which we just had a potlatch. I was telling Christie, our clan had a huge potlatch, and what was the equivalent of millions of dollars being given away by people and communities and clans working for years to be able to collect monies, to give away to benefit others, just like we're doing today to try and raise funds to benefit others, was illegal. And when I did a paper when I was doing my master's degree, I found many documents, including this one, that they saw giving away wealth as an obstacle to economic progress. Literally, that was in an official letter. That was an obstacle to economic progress, to give money to those who need, or those people who you'd like to support. Consequences being 2 to 6 months in jail, and anyone gathering more than 5 people at a time. Women, again, according to the patrilineal model that was imposed as part of the colonization arriving from the ancient Greeks, that women were less than human and possessions of men. In the Indian Act, they were removed from leadership, ownership, and their community if they married a non-Indigenous person. And again, looking at those kinds of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, it was very important that they were respected and upheld and understood to be such important people in community. And that's really important to recognize that in our Western world. For example, when we saw female leaders, they were able to realize better outcomes than male leaders. So women are a really important role, as we all know today, in our societies as leaders. But it also meant that there are some aspects to it that we still see that were only recently removed, like that Bill C-31, which meant that if my mother married a non-Indigenous person, she would have her status removed, and I would have my status removed, only because she was a woman. And as opposed to that, if a man married in a non-Indigenous woman, she would be given status. So very much a gender-based bias against women. And we see that played out still today, including in different ways. But in that time, there was all sorts of sexual policing as well. That was very much Christian and colonial understood practices. Removing a woman from her child in the sense of maintaining their identity, we just talked about that. Women forced to leave the community if their husband passed away, which was horrific. Establishing Indian hospitals. And those Indian hospitals are something that, and I'm just going to ask my husband, the name of the book for the elder who was Medicine Unbundled. Was one that is a great book you have to find and read if you can. Medicine Unbundled describes locally in Victoria here the practice of Indian hospitals, where children all the way to adults, but mostly women and children, were put in hospitals from a young age. And in this one case, the story talks about a young woman, I think she was from the age of 4 to 14, who was strapped into a bed for her entire youth. Not occasionally, strapped for her entire youth into a bed, and a medical experimentation done on her. Sexual sterilizations were standard. Sexual assaults were normalized, and about 800 people died in those Indian hospitals. So that was one of many different colonial impacts, similar to the residential schools. Now, at this point and before, please take care of yourselves as you hear these things. We've lived through it. It's hard. It's difficult to speak about. It's difficult to hear. But it's important to know and understand when you're speaking to someone those realities that they face. For example, when you're speaking to me, you might not think of those things, or you might not assume that might be the case, or you might assume the case. You don't know where those triggers of trauma lie. And it's really important to understand the sensitivities that have to be had for people who have experienced these things, which is the vast majority of First Nations in Canada. So please just take care of yourselves as you go through this. So when we take a look at it, it is this is the pervasiveness of residential schools, Indian day schools, and Indian hospitals as well. We know that those kinds of intergenerational residential school syndrome aspects are passed along to future generations. All those things that were horrific acts undertaken by those people who are in charge of residential schools. Prohibited from speaking their own language. My uncle shared with me his own story of when he was 5 years old, and he showed his welt marks on his back from being whipped when he was 5 years old, trying to speak to his sister because he was scared. There was neglect, and child labor was used to build those types of facilities. Immoral forms of discipline were used, strapping, whipping with wire, whipping with boards and books, beating with fists. Most residential schools had some form of either an electric chair or a homemade electric chair to discipline children, tied to beds, locked in basements for days or hours, fed spoiled food or not fed at all, and in some cases forced to eat their own vomit. Emotional and physical abuse, medical experimentation, psychological abuse and humiliation for minor issues, poor medical treatment, and as was the norm in all of the news articles that you hear today, sexual abuse, violent rapes, and gang rapes were common. And they supported peer assaults. So rather than stepping in, they would just let those types of peer assaults happen and perpetuate them. Some children were beaten to death and forced to bury other children. When you hear about those residential school stories, it is something that is really quite common. And as we're hearing more and more about those lost children in residential schools, many stories are coming out about not just them going missing, but other kids having to be a part of it, and witnessing babies being burned. And those kinds of high death rates that young children should never see were a part of the reality of the majority of First Nations in Canada. And I say majority, I mean 99.9%, because that was the law. When we look at those effects today, they still affect our people. And what happened, even despite all of the understandings of how horrible it was, in 1913, and they recognized how bad it was and called it an expensive failure. In 1947, they produced a report called Liquidating Canada's Indians in 25 Years. I'm not making this up. This was actually, and you can still Google it today, there was a report talking about what was happening in residential schools. And they still turned a blind eye to it and didn't want to deal with it. So the last residential school only closed in 1996 and is recognized as intergenerational residential school syndrome. And it's crippled the social, cultural, and educational development of First Nations, with many First Nations who went to residential schools or grossly impacted by parents who went to residential schools are ill-prepared to rejoin their communities with little experience of ordinary life and terribly unprepared to deal with their own children. So in my case, and just sharing with you quickly, what we found is that I grew up without being told I love you. I was physically and psychologically abused. And it's those kinds of traumas that you see everywhere. So when we take a look at today, we still see systemic racism. We still see that kinds of activity happening, not only in the laws, but the policies of Canada and in the local laws that we have to challenge. So we're going to ask you to think about what those things are that you can do to be able to advance reconciliation, starting with, sorry, I skipped a slide there, understanding the Canadian Constitution, why that Royal Proclamation addition into it in 1982 was important, understanding the effects of transformative change to close the socioeconomic gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Really importantly, the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, which are intended to be able to rectify the wrongs of our Canadian history. And there are many of them, but they are really an important path, as is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we call UNDRIP, which has been adopted into law in BC as DRIPA in 2019. And so we're starting to see some amazing things happen in BC that's advancing that. When we think about other things we've seen in the world, in Germany, we've got to learn from this. In Germany, after the genocide of the Jewish people, the German government returned seized property back to their owners, lands, houses. And if they couldn't find those owners, they gave it to their descendants. They set up a $60 billion Make It Good Again program to make reparations. Private companies made reparations. Again, this is part of the B Corp belief. Towns made reparations. History classes were mandated. It was illegal to deny the Holocaust. We still see people denying the experience of Indigenous peoples in the history of Canada. That should be illegal. Across Germany, there were museums and sites and memorials called Sites of Memory that were created. And every year there is the annual commemoration that's been happening for decades. We just started doing that in Canada. Things that the German government said. Unspeakable crimes had been committed in the name of the German people, which entailed an obligation to make moral and material amends. Where in the world has one ever seen a nation that erects memorials to immortalize its own shame? Only the Germans had the bravery and humility to do so. Why can't Canada? The one last quote I want to share with you from Germany is the vast majority of today's population were either children then or had not been born. They cannot profess the guilt of their own crimes that they did not commit, but their forefathers left them a grave legacy. All of us, whether guilty or not, young or old, must accept the past. We're all affected by its consequences and liable for it. Then young and old generations must and can help each other to understand why it's vital to keep alive memories. It's not a case of coming to terms with the past. That is not possible. However, Anyone who closes his eyes to the past is blind to the present and doomed to repeat it. That's proven psychologically. There's been a lot of research done in Germany as to what is happening with that population in the wake of that acts of genocide. And what they found is that the first few generations, or the first generations after that, couldn't cope with facing it. And so they denied it. And then after that, it was the generation after that started to say, this is wrong. What our parents did, what happened by our predecessors, our ancestors, was wrong. And they only start to take action. But after 25 years, psychologically, as societies, we forget. That's why it's so important in Germany and so important for us in our world to be able to remember these horrible things so we don't repeat it. So we make sure that we provide a good legacy for our great-grandkids and not ever go there again. And this is the last closing piece, is whoever refuses to remember their inhumanity is prone to new risks of infection. So beautiful, beautiful teachings. Now, just closing this up and thinking about the challenge we want to issue you is racism is a social construct. Racism is also a system created for colonists and perpetuated by racism and racist people. To not be a racist, and to leave it at that, just to say, I'm not racist, is a passive response that doesn't require action or responsibility and forces or creates one in a position to ignore the true history of Indigenous people, Canada, and ignore the racist systems and inequality that exist today to serve what is now going to be becoming a minority of people. So if we take a look at Statistics Canada's projections, by 2036, immigrants and Indigenous people together will make up a majority of the population of Canada. Looking at that huge diversity, that beautiful diversity that's going to be who Canada is, we have to be anti-racist. When, as individuals, we contribute to racism and racial inequality, we are racist. So we're either a part of the problem or a part of the solution. So when we take a look at anti-racism, it shifts our focus from the intent of our actions, I didn't mean to do that, to what did I actually do? Whether we advance racial equality or uphold racial inequity. So what we do is what matters. It's not enough to believe that you're not racist because it won't eliminate racism or racial inequality. Instead, we have to work within ourselves, our networks, our institutions, our governments to challenge racism in each decision that we make. They all have consequences. The practice of anti-racism is an ongoing effort and it's everyone's responsibility. So what we're seeing is an emerging trend amongst those leaders in BC as institutions, as associations, as the government of BC, is that they are starting with reconciliation that recognizes the harms done, which is why it's so important that we went over and shared the true experience of harm that was a part of the history of our people, a part of the history of Canada, and apologizing for those harms. Now, I want to share with you a story that was just so meaningful for me. I went out for breakfast one day when I was in Vancouver with my son and my husband, and a young server came up and said, this is last year around the same time, and said, I just wanted to tell you, I'm so sorry for what happened. And I'm going to get weepy because it meant so much, because it's not that he did it. I know he didn't do it, but he was a part of the solution. He said those words. And it was really meaningful, not just for me, but for my son. My son was very touched by that. So apologizing for those harms is something that we've inherited and we need to be able to, again, recognize. And the other parts that we're seeing as best practices in BC is that there are commitments to actions that are ethical and within one scope of professional and personal responsibilities and abilities to act to change beliefs, educate others, become anti-racist, stand against racism, and affect systemic change through laws, policies, programs, procedures. And most importantly, to be accountable. That if you say you're going to do this, you do it, and you report back to say, this is what I've done. This is a beautiful path forward for everyone today, for all people in BC and Canada today. This is how you enact reconciliation. It's not just about talk. It's not just about you learning. It's not just a passive, I'm not racist. It actually means you have to do something. That's what we're talking about, unsettling yourself. Unsettle yourself and think about what you can do. What can you do to make it a better future for your grandkids? That means recognizing those harms for yourself, learning more about it, reading UNDRIP, reading the TRC calls to action, looking and learning about the inequality in our systems today, including learning about the First Nations on lands that you currently live on. They're their lands. We're all guests. I'm down in Sauk Territory. I'm Haida, so I'm a visitor down here too. And I treat myself accordingly with respect to those nations, that lands I live on. Apologize for those harms. Again, I kept thinking about how these formal apologies from different organizations are so powerful. But what's going to stop us from individually apologizing to help support healing every single person? It didn't hurt that server, that young server who was probably 18 years old, from telling us that. And yet it meant so much. And making it right through actions that are ethical and, again, within an individual scope of professional responsibilities and abilities to change those beliefs in your family, in your community, in your organization, and take part in events that are designed to combat racial injustice. Again, looking at the diversity of Canada, it's going to be a majority diversity very soon. How can we say that those kinds of policies are okay for anyone? Because you know what? Everyone here today, everyone in Canada, your kids, your grandkids will be marrying someone from Africa, someone from East Indian, someone who's there. We're going to have a very diverse population, and we have this prophecy called the Rainbow Children, where we have multiple races in all of our grandkids. That's the reality. And when we take a look at that, we cannot say that it's okay for our grandkids to be subject to these kinds of racist policies and behavior, which means we have to act today. When we take about racism, make space for diversity, empower diverse voices. That means empowering diverse voices means letting them speak, not speaking for them. And learn benevolent harm. It's one that we really need to encourage people to learn about. What is benevolent harm? Google it, look it up, learn it, don't do it. Advocate for systemic change and laws, policies, and procedures, and be accountable to yourself, your family, your friends, and say, this is what I'm going to do. Now, at this point, I just want to share with you, for those people in North Van, and I know where Cove Financial is, that in Tsleil-Waututh's territory, they're going to be doing a pilgrimage to commemorate the sites where their kids had to walk to their school, their residential school. They had a huge long walk that they had to do, these kids, every single day to get to school. And that was across town. And they're going to have all of their community walking with orange shirts along that path. And they're inviting the public to create a wall of protection and line up on the sidewalks along that route to take care of those people. So when we take a look at your company, again, the B Corps, so much good work that Cove Financial is doing. These are some of the things you can carry over as well. Recognize those harms and continue learning. Apologize for those harms. Create an apology. It's not going to take away from Cove Financial to be a part of creating an apology and encouraging other B Corps to do so, or your company to do so, or your family to do so, or teaching your kids to do so. Making it right through actions that are ethical within those scope of professional responsibilities and abilities. Changing your company's laws, policies, and procedures to make sure that they consider diverse voices and histories and experiences, and advance reconciliation, be anti-racist, develop relationships and work with those nations whose lands you work and live on to create positive change consistent with their laws and their ways of knowing and being. They can teach you a lot. Again, there's this whole idea that's so pervasive, not only in academia, but around the world, that Indigenous knowledge is less than. And the Indigenous science has been what has led Canada, what has led most Western countries to be able to do the work that they do, to have the strengths that they have based on Indigenous knowledge. So there's a lot of strength and knowledge there that needs to be integrated and accepted and respected. Celebrate First Nations culture within your organization, and be accountable. Whatever you commit to do, do it. That kind of integrity, personally, as a company, as a society, we need to make that a practice. We need to be able to say we're going to do what we need to do. That's what good leadership is. Unsettle your local government. When we first talked about this, and we were talking about how local settler populations forced local governments to do all these horrific acts, and they became policies and laws and affected all of Canada, it's the same way that we're looking at environmental conservation and climate change being acted. Local governments are the only path forward that's going to make that change. Speak to your local government. It's October 15th coming up that you're going to vote in all of BC for your local government leaders. Find those leaders who are anti-racist and communicate to them, I'm voting for you because of this. You better stay anti-racist, which means you have to advance reconciliation. You have to look at diverse voices. You have to create a fair and just society where I live. And ask them to apologize for those harms. Be a part of that voice of recognizing and making right. And advocate for them to make things right. When we take a look at local governments, it's sharing power. In New Zealand, they require seats to be set aside for local First Nations, so they have a say in those rules that affect them in the local area. They have, there's other best practices in Victoria, and there's probably many others. In Victoria, they're sharing their tax base. It was originally much higher, but they still voted in and expect it to grow so that that annual tax revenue goes back to the First Nations as well. Support land back. There's many local governments that are doing that. And supporting community development of First Nations on whose land the municipality exists in, and to advance racism and reconciliation. I will share the resources in here for everyone, so you have a copy of the PowerPoint if you wish. But at this point, we wanted to be able to stop and ask you to share your questions, your thoughts, your feedback, and challenge you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to advance reconciliation? And what are you going to do to commit yourself to change? So please feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions, to put questions in the chat room. Christie?
Wow. Thanks, Laara. That's a lot. But really super good information. So I will reiterate what Laara said. I invite you to type questions into the Q&A box. Also unmute yourself, ask a question, or put your hand up and I will ask you to unmute. I'm just looking to see, I don't see anything right now, but I wrote down a ton of questions. So I can take this opportunity to ask some of them. One of the things that I also want to add, I don't know if it's a question or a conversation, it's super important that we, and I think your message was there, but I want to just bring it home, is that we listen. I think that's some of the mistakes that us as, and I'm going to say this right now, I'm a white privileged female. I am white privileged. That's a fact. And I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm not proud or unproud of it. It's just a fact. I grew up in white privilege, and to actually acknowledge that, I think, is important. But we need to listen to what is required. And I think I said that in my first thing is we go to these First Nations and ask, what can we do? Not tell them what they need. And then do you have any comments on that and the importance of that?
I do see a question in the chat room from Nikki Downey.
Okay.
It asks, are there currently any actions being taken to try and get land out of the Crown's control? And if so, how can people help? The control of lands by the Crown is something that's undertaken through the Queen's Bench, the highest ruling court in the land. And to overturn that's been really difficult. It's one of the core premises of the Indian Act. It's not been something that's been able to be done. Again, local actions can help to take it out of the Crown's control is local government advocacy, to be able to do land back efforts. And it's happening all the time. It's fantastic to see where there's agreements happening for land back. But at the Crown level, at the federal level, again, speak to your senator, your MP, those people that can help support bringing this to light as an understanding that's unacceptable. That if First Nations are stewarding those lands and resources, they should have control over that to be able to build houses, to build and develop economic development, or build things to be able to benefit economically and have some social justice in that regard. So unfortunately, it's not an easy answer, but it does require, and it will change the world if you can advocate for those things. So great question. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
I'm going to allow, we have a question from Bernie Geiss. You can now unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Laara. So great to have you. Thank you very much for doing this. And I want to take this opportunity to apologize for all the harm that you and your family and ancestors and people have experienced. So thank you for sharing that. And I found that very interesting that a young person would come up and say that. And it would never have occurred to me because when I am in the presence of First Nation people, um, I don't really know what to say, and so therefore it wouldn't occur to me to make that statement. So thanks for that. So if I'm with a person, I should not feel uncomfortable in making that statement towards them in a genuine way.
Yeah, and I would urge you not to judge the response. Some people will be touched, some people will be shocked because you're basically looking at the deepest wound they hold. And it's beautiful to do that apology, but people will react differently in different ways. They might be scared, they might cry, they might go, "Oh, no, 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 it's okay." And that's a coping mechanism, right? "No, no, no, you don't need to do that." Those are all coping mechanisms because I can't cope with that right now. So don't judge what they do, judge what you do. And again, the way this young gentleman did it was so beautiful. It was just, I just want to say he did it so gently and so respectfully. I know I wasn't part of this, but I just want to apologize for what happened. And it was just so beautiful. So yes, I encourage that.
Excellent. On the topic that Nikki brought up is, I guess one of the things that we could do as an organization is we could start a letter or a petition. So maybe what we could tell people who are listening to this that we have your email address, and maybe Laara, you could help us craft something that would be effective, and we can distribute that and promote it and see if we can get some signatures and send it to the right people. So thank you for
Absolutely.
being here.
We have a question from Jenna Cloughey. She said, "I appreciate the statement about education on our history so we don't repeat it. I feel that Canada's history was shocking to me as an adult as I was told something completely different." Yes. Most people say that. Childhood and ongoing education on this, just like Germany on Holocaust, needs to be implemented here. Are there any efforts right now we can support to ensure that Canadian curriculum is recognized in the scope yet nationally supported? Yes, that's happening quite a bit. Encourage them. Talk to your teachers. Talk to your school district. Ask them to be a part of it. What can I do to help bring to light what happened in the history of Canada and ensure that it's accurate and that it's representative of First Nations experiences. Even just that question is basically how we started Kileepi Piseesi Society and the act that we did. When my daughter was going to Cove Secondary, she was in a social justice class, and I spoke to one of the instructors, Andrea Yao, there, and I said, there's all this stuff happening. I'd like to volunteer to be able to share some of my thoughts on that. And she said, "Oh, that'd be great. And whatever I can do, let's see what we can do." And oh, well, actually, we have a social justice class, and we do this. Well, why aren't we doing travels for supporting people and people in need? Why is it always going to Africa or going to South America? Why don't we do that in our own backyard where we see third world conditions in our own backyards? And she said, "Yeah, we should do that." And we started meeting Bernie and Christie, and all this beautiful stuff came out of that. So it's so powerful, what you can do, what you can affect, when you have a few people making change in that way.
I have a hand raised. Dave Galloway, I'm going to allow him to speak. You can unmute yourself, Dave, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Laura. I was just wondering if Cove would be willing to step up and kind of lead a group of just kind of like a study group, an action group, where we might participate once a month and just share what we've been working on, what we've been trying to move forward in action, as a way of just helping each of us stay more accountable. Often when you declare something publicly, you can be more accountable to it, and we can exchange ideas. And I think I'd love working with you and Bernie on something like that.
Well, that's a good question, Dave, because that's sort of why we started Kileepi Piseesi. And through Kileepi Piseesi, we do want to have more companies involved, Laara is involved in this as well. So she guides us to make sure that we are, doing things in a way that is going to be accepted. So Dave, we would love it if you would join us in some of these Kileepi Piseesi meetings. And I think definitely if we do this offline or whatever, anyone else who'd like to be involved, we certainly could start something like that. I think we're not opposed to it.
Well, that sounds good. Yeah, sign me up.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll hold you to that. At Cove, we do, it's called ReconciliAction, which means you can't just talk, you have to do. So we're gonna get a hold of you.
Publicly, David Galloway is committing. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Dave.
Oh, we had someone else, Dana. She said, sign me up too. There we go. Dave, Dana, I'm writing this down, you guys. I'm writing this down.
So they were asked, we had a question too about Dana asking about the sites of memorial. So those sites of memory are really important, and we talk about it all the time in our work, my husband and I, when we do this. That is something that the more we do, the better our societies are going to be, because as we do this, particularly with schools, where we can embed this with people who are our younger generations learning this, we're able to create those opportunities for them to go to local places during Reconciliation Day to recognize, respect, understand, and make right that history. So I see thousands across Canada, and that can be done by local corporations, local government, with local First Nations. There's a million different ways to do it. It's just do it. Just get it done. There's many different ways. I guess, sorry, one caveat I'd say is start with your local First Nations too. We saw this just yesterday going into Van City, and it was great that they had these little orange shirts, but they had plain style little medicine wheels on them, on these little pins that they had. And it's like, oh, that's nice, but that's not our culture. So it's really important to get to know your local First Nations. What is their culture? Where we are coming from is the Coast Salish, the coast territories, which is not, it's more these kinds of look and design, and other designs that are plains don't represent our culture. So get to know the local First Nations. Well, the one closing statement I'd like to share from John Lewis, who's an amazing African-American leader. He's get into good trouble, necessary trouble, and redeem the soul of your nation.
Wow. It's a good one. So just one more reaching out to say, is there any more questions? If so, if you want to raise your hand or put it in the chat box quickly, we have time for maybe one more. Oh no. Will we have access to the recording? Yes, we will. You will have access to the recording. I believe we will be doing a recap on our website that will include all the resources, Laara's slides, everything that was talked about here. So, and including I think the recording will be on YouTube, but I will get that information to you through the recap. We'll tell you where to find all of that.
Wonderful. And Luciana was asking if we could do this presentation again in the near future. Absolutely. There'll be the recording, but we could do it again too, and maybe find ways to invite different people or do it in whatever format you'd like to see it.
Okay, someone asked, do you know if the Canadian governments are looking at Germany as an example of remedying past history? If not, why isn't it the case?
I don't know. No, they're not. They shared crib sheets on how to colonize, but they're not sharing crib sheets on how to reconcile. Oh. It's amazing. No, they're not. It's been up until now, it's been more than a decade since the TRC calls to action, and it's been a very passive response. But having said that, it's really exciting to see some of those common threads and themes of ReconciliAction that we summarized at the end that we're seeing in BC, from different levels of government, different associations, and like Cove Financial. So absolutely starting to happen, but it hasn't been a sharing of those kinds of reconciliation best practices yet.
Okay. You did mention B Corps, and I will sort of give a shout out to them. Cove Continuity is a B Corp, and the reason we are is we believe that businesses can make a difference. We can't rely on governments to take care of these details. And I think as businesses, as business owners, as employees of businesses, it's important that we use our business as a tool for good. So if you're looking for work or you're already in a company, explore this. See if you can get your company to take, because our it's not shareholders, it's stakeholders. It's the people, it's the environment, it's the earning of profit as well. But there's more to don't just think about profit. Let's see what we can do as a community to make things better. So this is what our business is about, and we'd love to see more people join it. So we're getting close to the end. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Laara for her amazing presentation. I think we all got a lot out of it. I would also like to thank everyone behind the scenes that made this webinar possible. And I would like to thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to take this journey with us. I would also like to ask you to please consider donating to ReconciliAction with Kileepi Piseesi fundraiser. I put the link in there several times in the chat box. I can quickly put it in there again. Sorry, let me just do that. I can't multitask, even though I know I'm female and I'm supposed to be able to, but I can't. So there it is. It's in there again. Also remind you that you will be receiving an email with a survey tomorrow, just asking about what you thought of the webinar. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to quickly complete it to help us improve what we're offering in the future. Let us know if you'd like to see Laara back again, because I think we would. Also, if anyone requires further information or has questions that we were unable to answer, or you would like to participate in some of the Kileepi Piseesi projects in the future, please feel free to reach out to me at Christie@coveadvisors.com. That's CHRISTIE at coveadvisors.com. I'm going to pop that one in the chat box as well now. And Laara, if you want to pop yours in, people may want to get a hold of you as well. So that's really it. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And Laara, is there anything you'd like to say as parting comments?
I just wanted to say thank you everyone for being here today, for opening your hearts and minds to this kind of learning and understanding to create a better world for current and future generations. We're all, again, part of the solution and part of the problem, and you being here today is part of the solution. So, and Haida Hawa, which is thank you from the bottom of my heart.
All right. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.